This is the story of Erastus, the city treasurer of Corinth, a man with power in his hands and questions in his heart. His world was one of ledgers, columns, and civic pride. But beneath the polished marble and golden statues, something eternal was stirring. Because God uses people in high positions to support the gospel in practical ways, even people who never expected to be part of something so holy. Erastus lived high above the city in a house built into the stone hillside, overlooking the theaters, temples, and racing grounds of Corinth. Below, the city buzzed with trade and politics, but up here, his world was quieter, more controlled. He liked it that way. His fingers were used to counting coins, checking records, and adjusting the city's finances down to the last coin. Roads didn't build themselves. Aqueducts didn't flow without planning. Statues of emperors didn't rise unless Erastus signed off. And in Corinth, that meant something. His name was etched into stone at the edge of a major road, the kind of honor that made most men proud. But Erastus was not most men. He had grown up in the shadows of Corinth's marble towers, the son of a builder. He knew what it meant to work with his hands, to carry bricks before he could read numbers. But the older he got, the more he saw how decisions made with a pen could build just as much as those made with a hammer. And so he climbed, quietly, steadily, until the city's resources passed through his hands like water through a gate. He had seen it all: bribes, alliances, festivals for gods he no longer believed in, and politics that turned friends into enemies. Still, he had remained fair. That was his pride, his balance, his order. Everything made sense when numbers were clean. But something had been bothering him lately. A new group had started meeting in houses, speaking of a man named Jesus, crucified, risen, and alive. They didn't riot, they didn't beg, but they didn't blend in either. The leaders of the city called them foolish. Others called them dangerous. Erastus didn't say anything at all. He simply watched. He noticed the way their widows were cared for, the way slaves and merchants sat side by side without shame. He'd even seen one of their gatherings by accident, late at night, near the eastern wall. They were praying, laughing, eating bread like it was sacred. He never expected such warmth to make him feel cold. That morning, Erastus stood beneath a colonnade, reviewing contracts for a new road. The workers had been paid. The stones were being delivered. Everything was going according to plan. And yet, he kept thinking about that group, the way they called it. He wondered what kind of world they were building, not with coin, but with conviction. And for the first time in years, Erastus began to wonder if all his careful planning was preparing him for something greater than a city road. Something eternal. The next morning, the smell of damp parchment and warm olive oil filled Erastus's study. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, catching the edges of bronze tools and polished scroll weights. He was already seated at his desk, stylus in hand, making quiet adjustments to the city's financial allocations. A bridge in the West Quarter needed reinforcement. A new marble statue was being commissioned. The usual business of a man trusted with the wealth of Corinth. But something in him had shifted. For years, his decisions were made with cold precision. If it balanced the books and pleased the council, it was good. If it brought glory to the city, even better. But now, something else was at work behind his calculations, a thought that kept returning. What if this influence, this role, wasn't only for the city? His hand paused above the wax tablet. What if it was meant to serve something deeper? He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the open window. Far in the distance, beyond the stone walls and merchant homes, a narrow alley curled through the poorest part of Corinth, a place he rarely visited. But he knew that's where the followers of Jesus often met, in borrowed rooms, behind unmarked doors, far from the applause of the world. He had heard rumors that one of their teachers, Paul the tent maker, had returned briefly, just passing through. It wasn't public knowledge. Paul's name stirred too much trouble for that. But Erastus had listened to Paul once, months ago, when the man spoke in a courtyard outside the city gate. He had spoken of a kingdom not built by hands, of grace that couldn't be bought or earned. Erastus didn't believe in superstition, but this gospel, it wasn't superstition. It was something else. He didn't speak of it to the council. He never brought it up during city meetings or banquets. But quietly, behind the smooth surface of his responsibilities, the idea kept growing. Maybe I'm meant to help them, not with words, with what I already have. Later that evening, as lamps glowed in his hall, Erastus called for his steward. "There's a storehouse in the lower quarter," he said calmly. "The one with unused clay and timber. Clear it out, quietly. Leave it empty and leave it open." The steward blinked. "For what purpose, sir?" Erastus closed the ledger and looked up. "Just do it, and speak of it to no one." He gave no further explanation. He didn't need to. He was already making room for something that couldn't be calculated. Not yet. Days passed, and the city thrummed with its usual rhythm. Debates in the council hall, chariots on polished roads, and crowds gathering at the theater to hear the latest orator. But Erastus moved through it all with quiet purpose, like a man listening for something no one else could hear. The cleared-out storehouse in the lower quarter remained untouched, just as he had instructed. No official plans were made for it. No workers sent to repurpose it. From the outside, it looked like a forgotten corner of the city, just another building with dust on its doorframe. But Erastus noticed the candle wax on the threshold one morning, and he noticed the footprints. Someone had been there. He said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention to the treasury. A new request had come across his desk, one marked as urgent. The city wanted funds to sponsor a temple festival, a celebration to honor Aphrodite. It would involve processions, music, and a statue unveiling. It would bring applause from Rome. It was expected. He stared at the tablet. It would also cost enough to feed 100 poor families for a season. Erastus didn't frown or show emotion. He simply reached for the next tablet in the stack. Then, after a pause, he pushed the festival request aside. That evening he walked alone, no escort, no steward, just the sound of his sandals against the stone. He went to the storehouse. He didn't knock. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. It was dim, quiet, but not empty. A few oil lamps flickered along the walls, and sitting in a circle on the floor were men and women, some young, some old. A child dozed in a mother's lap. Bread and dried figs sat in a wooden bowl at the center. They didn't gasp or scramble when he entered, but they did look up. One of them, a gray-bearded man with gentle eyes, nodded slowly. "You're welcome here." Erastus didn't answer at first. He glanced around, then stepped closer. His voice was low. "I'm not here to speak," he said. "I'm here to listen." No one asked why the city treasurer was standing in a dusty room with common people and quiet prayers. No one asked what it meant that the city's resources had quietly shifted in their favor. And Erastus didn't explain. Because something sacred was happening, and he wasn't there to control it. He was there to serve it. The next morning, Corinth sparkled beneath a golden sky, but Erastus felt the weight of a different kind of light. He sat at his desk with a city map unrolled before him: roads, buildings, aqueducts, amphitheaters. Every inch of it had passed through his hands at some point. And yet, last night's gathering stayed more vivid in his mind than any civic structure he'd ever approved. They hadn't asked for anything. No one begged. No one hinted. They shared bread, read from letters Erastus had never seen before, and prayed with eyes closed tight and hearts wide open. And the way they spoke of Jesus, not as a legend, not even as a martyr, but as someone alive, left something stirring in him that he couldn't explain. He ran his finger along a street on the map. A narrow, older road in the southern quarter, one badly in need of repair. The council had debated whether it was worth fixing. Erastus had kept it low on the priority list, but now he thought of the widows who lived in that quarter, of the small gatherings that happened behind unmarked doors, of the way rainwater flooded the path and left the elderly walking through mud. He dipped his stylus into ink and quietly began a new allocation. Southern Quarter stonework improvement. Priority. High. He said nothing to the others in the council. They'd assume it was part of routine infrastructure maintenance. He let them assume. But for Erastus, it was more than stones and gravel. It was a path. For the gospel to move more freely, for people to reach each other in safety and dignity. It was a small thing. But then again, every wall starts with one brick. That night, Erastus didn't return to his hillside home right away. Instead, he walked the streets like he used to when he was a builder's son, observing the cracks, the gutters, the corners where people gathered and where people were forgotten. He made mental notes as he went. Who needed shade? Who needed clean water? Who needed simple benches for tired backs? None of these would show up in city festivals or grand speeches, but Erastus had begun to see the work of the gospel not just in preaching, but in providing. When he finally did return home, he climbed the steps with sore legs but a quiet heart. He didn't feel important. He didn't feel holy. But he felt useful. And for a man who once thought power meant control, it now meant something else entirely. Service. Rain fell softly over Corinth the next morning, turning marble roads slick and making the air thick with the scent of wet stone and olive trees. Most officials stayed indoors when the weather soured, not Erastus. With his cloak pulled over his shoulders and a wax tablet tucked under his arm, he walked the streets of the southern quarter. He paused to speak with stoneworkers, quietly confirming the start date for repairs. He noted the gutters clogged with leaves in the corner where a broken drain spilled water into the path. To anyone watching, he looked like a dedicated public servant inspecting civic projects. And he was. But underneath that purpose, something deeper was happening. He passed a home where children were gathered around a woman telling stories. Not fairy tales, scriptures. Old ones about Moses, David, the prophets. He recognized some, but not all. The door was cracked open just enough to hear her voice say, "God does not forget the lowly. He lifts up those who trust him." Erastus paused only a moment, then walked on. But her words stayed with him. Back in his office later that day, he reviewed requests for new city monuments. One proposal stood out, an extravagant marble arch in honor of a visiting Roman dignitary. It would cost more than a year's wages for a dozen families. It was politically smart. It would earn him favor. He stared at the request. Then quietly, he folded the page and set it aside. Instead, he wrote a small grant for repairs to the public fountain near the east wall, a place where water often ran dry and children played in the dust. No one would praise him for it. No monument would bear his name. But in the stillness of his heart, Erastus felt something like peace. That night as he returned home, he found a slip of parchment tucked beneath a stone at his door. No seal, no name, just a short message in a careful hand. Thank you for the road, for remembering us. He read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the inner pocket of his robe. He didn't know who had written it, but he knew why it mattered. Because sometimes obedience to God isn't loud or celebrated. Sometimes it's a quiet decision, a hidden gift, a road made safe for feet that carry the message of life. And Erastus had decided. That was the kind of man he wanted to be. This is how Erastus's life began to split. One half public, one half sacred. By day, he attended council meetings, signed contracts, and reviewed budgets. He wore his indigo robe, spoke with authority, and made decisions that kept Corinth running smoothly. No one questioned him. He had earned their trust. But by night, he slipped quietly among the followers of Jesus, still not a preacher, still not a teacher, but present, listening, watching, helping where he could. He never sat in the center of the gatherings. He stood near the edges, arms crossed, head bowed. When someone needed food, he arranged it. When a widow needed repairs to her roof, a crew showed up the next morning. No one traced it back to him. That's how he preferred it. One evening, something changed. Paul had returned to the city again, briefly, passing through on his way elsewhere. Word spread through the small community like wildfire, and they gathered in a larger home that night. Erastus stood in the back corner, as always, when Paul entered. He didn't recognize him at first. Paul was thinner, older now. His cloak was patched, his eyes sharp, but his voice, steady, burning, hadn't changed. Some of you have high positions, Paul said plainly. Use them well, not for yourself, not for praise, but for the body of Christ. There's no small role in the kingdom, only faithful ones. Erastus felt his throat tighten. He hadn't spoken to Paul directly, never introduced himself, but now Paul's words felt like they were aimed right at him, not to shame, but to call. He stayed after the others left, pretending to study the stonework near the doorway. Paul noticed him but didn't push. "You've been helping," Paul finally said, quietly. Erastus nodded. "I'm not like the others. I don't preach. I don't know scripture by heart." Paul smiled faintly. "You don't need to speak loudly to carry weight. God placed you where you are for a reason. Use what's in your hands." They didn't talk long, but those few words stuck to Erastus like wax to parchment. Back home, he stood by the window overlooking the city, his city, the streets, the pillars, the glow of lamps flickering across rooftops. He realized then, Corinth didn't need another hero. It needed a treasurer who believed the kingdom was more than stone and silver. And Erastus was ready to be that man. The sound of hammers echoed through the southern quarter as the road crews worked steadily. Stone by stone, the broken path was being rebuilt. Nothing grand, nothing noble in the eyes of Rome. But Erastus watched from a quiet distance with a sense of purpose. It wasn't just road work anymore. It was an offering. Later that week, he met with a small group of officials to approve plans for the upcoming civic games. There would be races, speeches, and of course, a dedication ceremony to honor a foreign envoy. As treasurer, Erastus was expected to arrange the city's financial gift, a golden wreath. He nodded through the discussion, kept his tone professional, and offered no objection. But after the meeting ended, He returned to his office, shut the heavy door behind him, and sat in silence. His eyes wandered to the corner where he kept a second ledger, one not marked by the city's seal. It contained names, quiet needs, notes in his own handwriting. There was no record of it in Corinth's archives. It was his alone. He added a new line. 24 oil lamps for homes in the lower quarter. Discreet delivery. A week earlier, one of the believers had mentioned that several homes met for worship in the dark, unable to afford steady light. No one had asked Erastus to do anything about it. But that didn't matter. He closed the book, feeling the weight of what it meant to be trusted by God. That evening, he stopped by the storehouse. It had become more than a gathering place. People now referred to it in hushed tones, the safe place. Not because of the building, but because of what happened inside it: truth, prayer, unity. Erastus didn't enter this time. He simply left a bundle at the door, candles, bread, and one sealed pouch of coins. No note, no sign. He turned to go, and nearly bumped into a young man carrying a sack of figs. "Forgive me, sir," the man said, bowing quickly. Then his eyes widened slightly. "Wait, are you—" "No names," Erastus said softly. "Just serve well." The man nodded slowly, clutching the sack to his chest like it was treasure. As Erastus walked back through the sleeping city, a breeze swept down from the hills. The sky above was clear, stars sharp against the darkness. Somewhere far off, a hymn floated faintly through the streets. Erastus closed his eyes and breathed it in. He had wealth, he had rank, but none of it compared to the quiet joy of being part of something eternal, something true. He was no longer just the treasurer of Corinth. He was a servant of the kingdom. Morning came with a warm wind blowing in from the sea. Corinth's flagstones glistened from a light night rain, and Erastus stood at the far edge of the forum where construction crews prepared for another public project. A new bathhouse, meant to honor a senator's recent visit. The plans were expensive: decorative mosaics, imported marble, grand statues. It was the kind of project that politicians loved: visible, impressive, forgettable in a few years. Erastus reviewed the documents and made the final approval with a calm nod, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He wasn't building monuments anymore. Not in his heart. Later that day, he visited the treasury vault to conduct an official inspection. He counted coin jars, checked wax seals, and reviewed shipment logs. Everything was in order. And yet, while his hands were busy with silver, his mind was fixed on another kind of wealth, the kind measured in meals shared, roads mended, and candles lit in dark rooms. That evening, as the sky turned amber, Erastus made his way toward a small home tucked between a baker's shop and a leatherworker's stall. He knocked once, quietly, and the door opened to reveal a young widow holding a baby on her hip. She blinked in surprise. "Sir Erastus?" He held out a small jar of oil and a folded piece of cloth. "The city has resources set aside for those in need," he said, not explaining further. Tears welled in her eyes. "But I never asked." He offered a small smile. "That's why you received it." Before she could speak again, he turned and walked away. Back in his own home that night, Erastus unrolled one of Paul's letters, one he had borrowed and read many times before. He knew it nearly by heart, but this time one line struck him deeper than ever. "Those who have shared in spiritual things ought also to share in material things." He read it again and again. He thought of all the meals he had eaten in silence while others prayed over scraps. of how easy it was to give generously in the eyes of men and yet give reluctantly in the eyes of God. And so, that night, he opened a chest in the corner of his room, the one he never touched. It was filled with gifts he'd received over the years, rings, robes, ceremonial trinkets from visiting officials. He began placing them in a sack, not to keep, to use. If the kingdom was to grow, someone had to be willing to give quietly, without applause. Erastus had finally accepted that someone was him. The next few weeks passed without noise or notice. No one called Erastus a hero. No statues were built in his honor. In fact, no one outside the small group of believers even knew what he was doing. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The sack of valuables he had once locked away in his home was now empty. One ring had paid for fresh tunics for orphans. A gold brooch had become a month's worth of grain for widows. Even his ceremonial seal, an old one, replaced long ago, had been melted down to help repair a leaking roof where a family met to pray. He still handled city business, still attended meetings, still wore the robes of a man with influence. But inside, he was becoming lighter, freer, like someone who had stopped clinging to treasure and started becoming it. One afternoon, as he reviewed building permits, a messenger came into his office unannounced. The young man looked nervous and held a crumpled scrap of parchment. "From the house church in the North Quarter," he whispered, glancing around. Erastus took the note. It was brief. "Our sister Junia has fallen ill. Her family is struggling. We ask only for prayer." Erastus read it twice, then tucked it into his robe. He said nothing to the messenger, only nodded. By nightfall, a healer had been quietly paid to visit Junia's home. A basket of food and fresh linens had been left at her door, unsigned. And though Erastus never spoke to her family, he lit a lamp in his study that night and prayed, awkwardly, honestly, for someone he had never met. That same week, Paul sent word that he would be leaving the region again. There was talk of more persecution in other cities. Corinth was safe for now, but the church knew its comfort could end at any moment. Erastus attended the gathering before Paul's departure. The room was full, and the mood was heavy. Paul spoke of endurance, of hope, of pressing on. But then near the end, he did something unexpected. He paused, looked around, and then said, "Some of you have given more than coin. You've given strength to the body when it needed it most. One among us has done that in silence, faithfully." He didn't name Erastus. He didn't have to. Erastus sat quietly in the back, unmoving, heart thudding. Because in that moment he realized he didn't need to be known by everyone, just by the one who sees in secret. And in that, he was fully known, fully seen, fully used. A storm rolled over Corinth that night. Wind battered the rooftops and rain thudded hard against stone streets. Most of the city stayed inside, huddled around low fires, but Erastus didn't sleep. He stood by the window in his chamber, watching the water flow through the gutters he had once ordered to be built. He remembered when his job was only about the city, stone, silver, and statues. Now, he thought about people, faces, stories, needs, and he thought about what might come next. The gatherings were growing, slowly, quietly, but steadily. People who once scoffed at the way now came to listen. Families that had been torn apart by faith were finding healing. And though the church still met in borrowed rooms and dark corners, Erastus could sense it. They were becoming a force, a different kind of power, one that couldn't be taxed or tallied. But with growth came risk. Erastus had heard whispers in council chambers, suspicion, questions. Who was funding these house meetings? Why were resources shifting to poorer districts? Who was influencing the city behind the scenes? His name hadn't been mentioned yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Still, he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The next day, he took an unusual step. He wrote a letter, brief, precise, and sealed with his official mark. It was addressed not to a Roman noble or a Corinthian builder, but to Timothy, a young leader traveling with Paul. In it, Erastus offered a quiet commitment. I remain in Corinth. The work is not finished here. I will continue to serve the body, not with words, but with what I have been given. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need a title. He just needed to be faithful. That evening, he went to the storehouse again, not to drop off supplies, but to sit and break bread with the believers. He greeted them by name now. He didn't hide in the corner. Someone asked if he would pray before the meal. He hesitated, then nodded. His words were simple, halting, but honest. God, thank you for giving us enough. Help me, help us. Use what we have for others, for you. And as the candles flickered and the bread was passed, Erastus realized something. He was no longer divided between two worlds. He was fully in, fully his. And whatever came next, he was ready. It began with a letter from Rome, a polished scroll sealed in red wax, delivered to the Corinthian council chambers with great ceremony. Erastus read it among the other officials, face calm, heart steady. Rome was watching. The letter praised the city's growing prosperity but hinted, too politely, at concerns. Unregulated gatherings, it said, teachings that subvert loyalty to Caesar. And then, more sharply, reports indicate influence from within Corinth's administration. The room grew tense. Eyes flicked from one councilman to the next. Quiet glances, quiet guesses. Erastus said nothing. That afternoon, after the meeting adjourned, he walked the familiar path through the city, past the theater, past the newly repaired roads, past the fountains he had funded without ever attaching his name. He arrived at the storehouse, stepped inside, and found it full. Not with people, though they would come later, but with scrolls, baskets of food, blankets for winter, oil for lamps, quiet acts of preparation, quiet acts of love. He sat in the back corner, watching the door, waiting. A young woman entered, one he recognized from the night Paul had spoken. She glanced around nervously and then hurried over. "There's talk," she whispered, "that they might question the believers, that they might find you." Erastus looked at her, this girl with sandaled feet and anxious eyes, and smiled gently. "Then let them," he said. "Let them find a man who uses what God gave him." She looked confused. "But you could lose everything." He nodded. "I could. But if I stay silent, I've already lost more." That night, he wrote another message, this time to Paul. It was short, written on simple parchment, sealed with no title. "Whatever happens, I remain. Not to build temples, but to build trust. If I disappear from the record, remember this. I gave what I had so others could carry the message farther than I ever could." He folded it carefully and gave it to a traveler heading north. Then he returned to his work. More baskets to deliver, more roads to fund, more lamps to place in the windows of homes where people worshipped by candlelight, and courage. Because this was no longer about risk, it was about faithfulness, and Erastus had chosen his side. The wind changed in Corinth. It wasn't just the sea breeze, it was the tone in the streets, the tension in the marketplace, the looks passed between soldiers and citizens. Something was shifting. Rome had turned its gaze toward the growing group known as followers of the way. And when Rome paid attention, people got nervous. Still, Erastus continued his work. By day, he oversaw new projects, signed civic documents, and kept the city's economy moving forward. His face was the picture of calm authority. He met with ambassadors, reviewed trade routes, and kept his position secure. No one suspected the quiet decisions behind the scenes, the shifts in the city budget that had helped repair homes, feed families, and care for the sick among the believers. By night, he moved through the lower quarters without guards or fanfare. He sat in meetings by lamplight. He carried sacks of grain over his shoulder. Sometimes he spoke. Other times he just listened. But always, he served. One evening, as he sat in the corner of a small gathering, a man stood to read from one of Paul's letters. Words Erastus had heard before, but never this clearly. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. Erastus bowed his head. He had no title in the church, no role in leadership, but he was a part of it. Every offering, every repaired road, every warm blanket left at a door, it all mattered. And God saw it. But as the message ended, a sharp knock rattled the door. The room went still. A young man peeked through the curtain. 2 guards, he whispered, from the city council. Hearts pounded. Mothers pulled their children close. Erastus stood slowly, lifting his cloak. "I'll go." The others protested. "They don't know it was you," someone said. "Let them pass. Don't speak." But Erastus shook his head. "This isn't about hiding. Not anymore." He stepped into the night, the wind cool against his face. 2 guards waited near the street, their torches casting long shadows. "Erastus," one of them said, "we've been sent to speak with you, quietly." He nodded. "Then speak." They looked unsure. "Some on the council. They're questioning your loyalties. They've noticed your attention to the lower districts. They think perhaps your heart lies with the ones who follow that Galilean." Erastus held their gaze. "And if it does?" One guard shifted. "Then you could lose your title, your income, your place among the city fathers." Erastus stepped forward, calm as stone. "Better to lose a title than to waste a life." The guards were silent. Then without another word they turned and walked away. Erastus didn't watch them go. He simply stood in the street, hands folded behind his back, as the stars came out one by one above the rooftops of Corinth. He returned to the gathering and opened the door quietly. "They may come again," he said, "but no matter what they take, they cannot take my purpose." The others nodded, not in fear, but in agreement. Because they understood now, this man, this city treasurer, was not afraid of being exposed. He was afraid of not being used, and whatever storm might be coming. Erastus had already chosen his foundation. Weeks passed, and though Corinth bustled on the surface, merchants bartering, statues gleaming, horses trotting through sunlit streets, there was a hush beneath it all, a tension. Rumors stirred like dust in alleyways. arrests in Rome, Paul imprisoned, believers scattered. Yet Erastus remained. Each morning he put on his official robes. Each evening he pulled them off and moved among the people no one saw. He walked the halls of government with poise, then knelt on cold floors to bandage wounds and carry water. The two halves of his life were no longer at war. They had become one seamless offering. But it wasn't easy. One morning, a messenger from Macedonia arrived, dusty, thin, and trembling. He carried a letter written in hurried script, smudged with the pressure of a hand gripping too tightly. Paul was in chains. Rome had finally acted. The believers gathered that night in the storehouse. No meal, no songs, just a heavy silence. They sat in a circle. The letter passed from hand to hand, eyes scanning the words slowly, as if hoping they would change mid-sentence. Erastus stood in the back, watching the weight settle over the room. Someone finally spoke. "What do we do now?" An older woman replied, her voice shaking, "We pray." A younger man added, "And we send help. Paul never left us alone. We won't leave him." All eyes eventually turned to Erastus. He wasn't their elder. He wasn't their teacher. But he was the one who had never stopped giving, who had built quiet roads and kept lamps burning, the one who had poured his authority like oil into the cracks of the early church. He stepped forward. "I have funds," he said, "enough to send to Rome, not through the council, through the believers. Quietly." A murmur of relief moved through the group, but Erastus wasn't finished. "I'll write a letter," he added, "not as a city official, as a brother, to remind Paul that his seeds are still growing, that we haven't lost heart." The room nodded. Someone whispered, "That's what he would want." That night, Erastus stayed late in his study, pen scratching against parchment. He didn't write like a politician. He wrote like a man whose heart had been rebuilt from the inside out. "Paul, I remain in Corinth. The waters rise, but the work continues. The brothers and sisters gather in strength. They walk roads you once walked. They speak your words. They cling to the name you taught them to love. I cannot preach, but I can build, and I will, until my last coin, until my last breath. You are not forgotten. The gospel still runs strong here, and I am still running with it." He sealed the letter, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in the hands of a trusted traveler. Then he returned to the storehouse. This time, not as a guest, not as a donor, but as part of the family. That evening, they broke bread again. They sang quietly, hands clasped. Erastus sat among them, the candlelight flickering across his face, not as a treasurer, but as a servant of something far greater. The storm had come, and he was still standing, not in pride, but in faith. It was just before sunrise when Erastus stepped outside, the sky still a blanket of deep blue stars fading slowly into dawn. The city of Corinth stretched out below him, its temples still cloaked in shadow, its streets quiet, its people unaware of how much had changed beneath the surface. He took a slow breath, the air cool against his face. He had made his final decision. Word had returned from Rome. Paul was still imprisoned, his health uncertain, but his message, oh, it lived. Letters were being copied and carried. House churches were multiplying. And the gospel that began with a Galilean rabbi was now coursing through the empire like a river, quiet, steady, unstoppable. Erastus knew what that meant. The eyes of Rome would only grow sharper. His position as city treasurer would soon be questioned, maybe revoked. And when that day came, the council would expect him to defend himself. But Erastus had nothing to defend. He had already given the city everything he was supposed to: aqueducts, roads, public works. And when God asked for more, his influence, his wealth, his quiet strength, he gave that too. This morning, however, something different stirred in his heart. He had spent years building in secret, supporting the church from behind the curtain, but now he sensed that it was time to stand. Not as a politician, not even as a provider, but as a believer. The believers gathered again that night, this time in the open courtyard of a home near the northern wall. It was a risk. No more shadows, no more hiding. But they came anyway. Dozens of them. Faces he'd fed, families he'd helped, children who had grown up playing near the roads he had repaired. They greeted him as he entered, not with fanfare, not with reverence, but with love. Someone had brought a letter to be read aloud, one of Paul's. As the words filled the courtyard, Erastus stood to the side, listening like always. But when the reading ended and silence settled over the group, something inside him rose. He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and spoke, not with grandeur, but with conviction. I am Erastus. You know me as a treasurer, a builder, a man of numbers, but I am also your brother. And I want you to know I do not serve this city alone. I serve the King, the one Paul spoke of, the one who gave his life and asks for ours. No one spoke. Then a man whispered, "But if they find out?" Erastus nodded. "They might take my title, but they cannot take my purpose." A gentle wind passed through the courtyard, and in that moment, no one saw a city official. They saw a pillar, strong, steady, immovable in the storm. He remained in Corinth. He continued the work. His name would one day be etched in stone again, not just in a Roman road, but in the legacy of the church, because God had used him, not as a preacher or a prophet, but as a man of position, provision, and quiet faithfulness. And the gospel moved forward, because Erastus stood behind it, holding it up with both hands.